Greetings, everyone. Before we begin, I'd love to know where and what time you're listening from. Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy our stories, leave a like and subscribe so you never miss one. Now, turn off the lights, close your eyes, and relax. Returning to my childhood home was not an act of nostalgia, but of surrender. My life in the city, with its promise of a future, was put on hold, packed into a pair of suitcases. My father's stroke hadn't killed him, but it had stolen something more precious, the anchor of his own mind. My mother couldn't care for him alone, and the nursing home, that word spoken in whispers, was a specter we were trying to keep at bay. So I returned, not as a son coming home, but as a guardian entering a museum where the exhibits move on their own. The house was the same, yet every corner was imbued with a new, frustrating sadness. The first few days were a descent into a subtle chaos. My father's dementia wasn't violent. It was a fog that reconfigured reality to its whim. My first confrontation with his new logic happened one morning when I had to go out for groceries. I couldn't find the car keys. I was certain I had left them on the metal hook by the door as I had for 15 years. But they weren't there. I searched the entryway table, the pockets of my jacket, the kitchen counter. Nothing. Frustration grew with each passing minute. I asked my father if he had seen them. He was sitting in the living room looking out the window. He turned slowly and looked at me with a calm that drove me mad. He said of course he knew where they were, that they were where I always left them. He stood up, walked slowly to the fireplace mantel and pointed. There they were, next to an old mantel clock. He assured me that this had always been their spot. I argued with him. I told him that never, not once, had we ever left the keys on the fireplace mantel. He simply shook his head, a pitying smile on his face, as if my memory were the one failing. He told me the stress was getting to me. His certainty was so absolute, so unbreakable, that for a moment I was the one who doubted. Was it possible? I left the house feeling like a stranger, a foreigner in my own past. This was the gaslighting of dementia, a constant erosion of your own reality, carried out by someone with no intention of manipulating you. My father wasn't lying. He simply inhabited a world whose rules only he knew, and I was an illegal immigrant in his strange geography. Frustration was my constant companion, but all of that, as exhausting as it was, belonged to the realm of the understandable. It was the sad, mundane decline of a brilliant mind. The real terror, the kind that now keeps me from sleeping, began not with a moved object, but with the house itself. It happened on a Tuesday morning. I got up before him and went down to the dark hallway. My hand automatically went to the wall, to the left of the living room doorframe, to turn on the light. My fingers met with smooth, cold wallpaper. I fumbled around, confused. There was no switch. I took a step back, frowning. I turned on the light in the foyer to illuminate the hall. And then I saw it. The light switch was not on the left side of the door. It was on the right. I stared at the white plastic plate, feeling a wave of vertigo. I was sure with the absolute certainty that only 30 years of muscle memory can provide, that the switch had always been on the left. It was a movement I had made thousands of times without thinking. When my father got up, I tried to approach the subject as naturally as possible. I asked him if he had called an electrician. He looked at me as if I were insane. He walked to the wall, flicked the light on and off several times, and then turned back to me with an expression of genuine perplexity. He told me not to be silly, that the switch had been there since they bought the house. His conviction was so total, so devoid of doubt, that for the first time I felt the floor open up beneath me. Was it possible that I, for my entire life, had misremembered such a fundamental detail of my own home? The idea was more terrifying than a switch that moves on its own. I tried to forget it. I told myself it was a false memory. But from that day on, I started noticing more things. The door to the bathroom closet, the one that had always creaked when it opened inward, now opened outward, silent and smooth. One day, returning from the store, the hallway felt different, brighter. It took me a minute to realize why. The walls, which had always been a pale yellow, were now a soft cream white, a subtle but total change. When I asked my father, his answer chilled me. He said of course they were white, that we had painted them together last summer, and what a bad memory I had. I started to feel like I was going crazy, a shared madness, a kind of architectural delusion that I was catching. I knew that my father, with his frail body and trembling hands, could not have rehung a door or painted an entire hallway overnight. The changes just happened. The house was transforming, obeying a new physical law that seemed to emanate from my father's broken mind. To preserve my sanity, I began to leave proof, anchors in reality. One night, I placed a book on the third shelf of the living room bookcase, exactly 10 centimeters from the edge. The next morning, the book was on the fourth shelf. I went to my room, took a small red sticker, and discreetly placed it on the bottom corner of a painting in the hallway. The next day, the painting was a centimeter higher on the wall, and the sticker was gone. I wasn't just being deceived. The evidence of my own lucidity was being systematically erased. The house wasn't just playing with me, it was cheating. The culmination of this first phase of horror came with the crack. On the ceiling of my old bedroom, there had always been a thin, lightning bolt-shaped crack. As a child, I would stare at it for hours, imagining it was a river on a map, a border between two imaginary countries. It was as much a part of my room as the bed itself. One night, I woke with a start. I felt that something in the room had changed. I turned on the light, and I looked at the ceiling. The crack was gone. The ceiling was a white, smooth, uninterrupted surface. I got out of bed, my heart racing, and ran my hand over the plaster. There was no sign of repair, no fresh paint. The crack was simply gone, as if it had never existed. I sat on the edge of the bed, feeling the panic suffocate me. This wasn't a switch or a door. This was a piece of my childhood, a landmark of my personal geography that had been erased from existence. I stumbled downstairs. I found my father in the kitchen humming an old song. He smiled at me, a genuine, loving smile. He asked if I was sleeping well, if the house was still as comfortable as I remembered. I didn't know what to say. I could only stare at him, and in that moment of clarity, I realized the terrible truth. He was not the cause. He was the catalyst. His broken mind wasn't simply confused. It had become a kind of transmitter, an antenna broadcasting a flawed version of reality. And the house, my house, for some horrible reason, was listening. And it was obeying. I felt like a typo in a book that was constantly rewriting itself. I was the only person in that house who remembered the previous version. And I didn't know how much longer my own mind could withstand the constant corrections. My father's comment, spoken with such absolute serenity, was the final blow. The window existed because he remembered it, or perhaps he had remembered it into existence. In that instant, I stopped fighting the current. I realized that I was the stranger, the ghost. I was the anomaly in a reality that folded and unfolded to the rhythm of a broken mind. I no longer tried to correct him, nor to leave proof of my own sanity. I became a silent observer, a castaway on the ocean of his past. The changes to the house accelerated, growing bolder. They were no longer subtle details. They were large-scale architectural transformations. One morning, the main staircase, which had always been in the center of the foyer, now rose from a corner of the living room. My father came down it with the natural ease of someone who has walked the same path every day of his life, not noticing my pale, incredulous face. My own bedroom began to shrink. Every day, the walls seemed to be a few centimeters closer, the ceiling a little lower, a slow, claustrophobic compression. I felt as if the house were trying to expel me, erasing the space I occupied. Paradoxically, as the house became more chaotic and unpredictable for me, My father seemed calmer, happier. He moved through the shifting hallways and reconfigured rooms with absolute confidence. It was his world. His memories, as fragmented as they were the scaffolding upon which each day's reality was built. I, with my intact memory of how things should be, was the one who stumbled into walls that weren't there yesterday, who searched for doors that had disappeared. The roles had been completely reversed. He was the master of the house, and I, the confused old man lost in his own home. I tried to escape. One afternoon while he was napping, I packed a small bag and went to the front door. When I opened it, the sun blinded me. But it wasn't the sun over the asphalt of the street. It was the sun over the grass of the back garden. The front door no longer led to the street. It led to the yard. I tried the kitchen door. It led to the upstairs hallway. My bedroom window no longer showed the neighborhood, but the brick wall of the house next door just inches from the glass. The house was a labyrinth, a trap that reconfigured itself to keep me inside. It was the cell, and my father's mind was the jailer. Desperate, I had an idea. If I couldn't fight the house, maybe I could guide it. If reality molded itself to my father's memories, then I had to try to control those memories. I began an experiment in inverted gaslighting. I dedicated my days to anchoring his mind in a stable past. One afternoon, I sat with him on the sofa with an old photo album. I opened it to a page showing a picture of the living room from a Christmas 20 years ago. In the photo, the built-in bookshelf took up the entire back wall. I pointed to the photo. I talked to him about that Christmas, about the books on the shelf, about how he used to sit and read next to it. At first, he seemed to follow along, nodding with a vague smile. But then his gaze shifted from the photo to the blank wall that now stood in its place, and his face contorted in a grimace of confusion, of pain. He asked me why I was lying to him, why I was showing him a photo of a house that wasn't his voice filled with a childlike anguish. He said that wall had always been blank. His agitation grew, and at the same time, I felt the house react. The lights flickered. I heard a loud crack from upstairs, as if a beam were splitting. A painting fell off the wall in the hallway. The house was suffering with his confusion. My attempt to anchor reality had only caused an earthquake in his fragile mind, and the house trembled with it. I took the album away, spoke to him in a soft voice, and calmed him down. And as I did, the lights stopped flickering. The creaking ceased. The house had returned to calm, molding itself once again to the version of reality his mind needed. I understood that my plan was useless and cruel. I could not impose my reality. I could only inhabit his. The dementia is a sea, and I had only managed to calm a small wave. The storm broke on a Thursday night. My father had a crisis, the worst I had ever seen. He woke up in the middle of the night screaming. He didn't recognize me. His eyes looked at me with absolute terror. He called me by another name. Arthur. He screamed about where Arthur was, that we had to hide. Arthur was his brother, my uncle, who had drowned in a lake when they were both children. My father's mind hadn't just jumped to another memory. It had shattered. In his panic, fragments from every era of his life collided, and the house responded to this collapse. The walls of my room vanished, replaced by the dark trees surrounding the lake of his childhood. The floor of the hallway became the icy water that swallowed his brother. I heard the sound of my mother's laughter from when they were young, mixed with the sound of my own crying as a baby. The house had become a physical manifestation of a broken mind, a three-dimensional collage of 70 years of life superimposed in a single chaotic instant. I ran through the house, which was no longer a house, but a labyrinth of times and places. One door led me to the hospital room where I was born. Another, to the office where my father had worked. The air smelled of my grandmother's apple pie and hospital chlorine at the same time. I was trapped in his head, and his head was an inferno of colliding memories. In the midst of the chaos, I heard it. My father's voice, but not that of the scared old man. It was the voice of a child calling for his brother. He was calling for Arthur, asking where I was, that he was afraid. I knew he was calling for me, the man whose face he didn't recognize. I looked for him, passing through fragments of birthday parties and family arguments. I found him in what used to be the living room, now transformed into the shore of a dark lake under a starless sky. He was huddled on the ground, a scared child in an old man's body. I knelt in front of him. His eyes, once clouded by dementia, now shone with a terrible clarity, the clarity of a perfectly preserved memory. He looked at me and he did not see his son. He saw his brother Arthur standing safe and sound. A smile of pure relief lit up his childlike face. He told me he had missed me. And in that moment, in the heart of the chaos, I understood. I couldn't fix the house, I couldn't fix his mind, I couldn't bring him back to my reality. But maybe, just maybe, I could join his. I stopped fighting. I stopped trying to impose my own memory over his. I accepted the role he had given me. I smiled at him. I told him I was here now, that he didn't have to be afraid. I embraced him. And as I did, I felt the house around us stop shaking. The chaos of colliding memories calmed. The walls of the lake faded and a single reality, a single memory settled around us. The house no longer changes. It has stabilized. But it is not the house I remember. It is the house from 1965. The walls have a wallpaper I had only ever seen in photos. The furniture is different. Sometimes I hear my grandmother's voice calling from the kitchen. My father is happy. In his mind, he is 10 years old again, and his older brother has come home. He spends his days in the garden, and I play with him. I don't know what I am. An echo, an actor, a voluntary ghost in my father's memory. I have lost my own life, my own past, my own name. He calls me Arthur, and I answer. The house protects us, insulates us from the outside world, which no longer seems real. I have found peace, but it is a borrowed peace, the peace of a character in someone else's story. I discovered that I could not get my father out of the prison of his mind. So I went in with him to keep him company. And now, we both live here, in the eternal summer of his childhood. Sometimes at night I look in a mirror and see a stranger, but then I hear my father laugh in his sleep, and I remember why I did it. It was my last act of love, to surrender my own reality so that his could finally be a happy place to stay. I have always been a man who appreciates silence. Not the absolute dead silence of a tomb, but the living silence of a quiet place. That was why I chose this apartment. I had come from a rental next to a train line, where every 20 minutes the world would tremble and a metallic roar would rattle the windows. That experience taught me to value peace. This old building, the kind they don't make anymore, with thick walls that promised to insulate me from the noise of the city and the lives of others, seemed like paradise. My work as a medical transcriber allowed me to spend most of my day at home, surrounded by a calm I considered my greatest luxury. The soundscape of my home was predictable. The soft hum of the computer, the distant murmur of traffic filtered through double-paned windows, the occasional creak of the floorboards. An ecosystem of familiar and comforting sounds. The first discordant note in my symphony of silence was so subtle I almost ignored it. It was a Tuesday night as I was working late. I heard a clear, distinct sound, that of a marble dropping on a wooden floor and rolling a few inches. It came from above. The sound wouldn't have bothered me except for the fact that the apartment upstairs, 4B, had been empty since I moved in more than 5 years ago. Mr. Alarcon, the former tenant, had passed away, and his children, caught up in some legal dispute, had never rented it out again. I stood still, listening. Nothing more. I blamed it on a pipe, on the settling of the old building, an acoustic anomaly, but the anomalies began to multiply. A few days later, while making dinner, I heard the unmistakable sound of a poorly tuned radio, a murmur of voices and static, which seemed to come from the wall I shared with the adjoining apartment, 4C. But 4C was also empty. It had been foreclosed on by a bank months ago. I went to the wall, pressed my ear against it. The sound persisted for a minute, and then vanished completely. Unease began to settle in my stomach. I started cataloging the sounds. The muffled cry of a baby that seemed to come from 2 floors below at 3 a.m. The sound of an out-of-tune piano playing the same clumsy melody over and over. A sound that seemed to have no clear origin, floating in the air of the inner courtyard. The building, my fortress of silence, was turning into a sounding board for phantom noises. My logical mind fought back. I convinced myself they were street sounds, amplified and distorted by the building's architecture. I decided to investigate to quell my fears. One night, I went up to the door of 4B. The air on the landing was cold, still. I pressed my ear to the wooden door. Absolute silence. Through the peephole, I could see only total darkness. The next day, I did the same with 4C. The mailbox was overflowing with unopened mail, bills and advertisements spilling out. I peered through the mail slot. I saw an empty, dust-covered hallway. No one lived there. My logical explanations were crumbling. The terror took another step, crossing the threshold from the external to the personal. The sounds stopped being strange and started to become mine. One afternoon, while reading in the living room, I heard the sharp whistle of my own kettle in the kitchen. I was puzzled, as I didn't remember putting it on the stove. I got up, and upon entering the kitchen, I saw the kettle sitting cold on the unlit burner. The whistling had stopped the moment I entered. Another time I heard the jingle of my keychain in the bowl by the front door, but when I looked, I could see the keys lying perfectly still, gleaming under the hallway light. One night, I heard my mobile phone's ringtone, a specific melody only I used, play from my desk. But my phone was on the table, its screen dark and silent. The entity, or whatever it was, had stopped emitting random noises. It was learning. It was recording the repertoire of sounds from my own home to play them back later, creating an impossible echo, a dissonance in my reality. I began to feel like a specimen in a glass cage, observed by an invisible scientist testing my reactions to different auditory stimuli. My sanctuary had become a laboratory, and I was the subject of the experiment. My work began to suffer. During transcriptions, I would hear whispers that weren't in the original recording, forcing me to rewind again and again, doubting my own hearing. I became irritable, jumping at the slightest real noise. The peace I had so craved had become a sonic minefield. The night I heard my mother's voice, my sanity fractured. I was in my study, concentrating on a transcription. The house was in absolute silence, and then from the other end of the apartment in the direction of the living room, I heard it. Her voice, clear, sharp, unmistakable. It spoke my name. Just that. A calling tone like when she used to call me for dinner as a child. My mother lived 400 kilometers away. I had spoken to her on the phone that very afternoon. An icy chill ran down my spine. My heart hammered in my chest. I sat frozen in my chair. My brain went to war with itself. There had to be an explanation. The window was open, perhaps a neighbor's television. But I lived on the 23rd floor. Impossible. The TV next door? The walls were too thick. I had never heard a thing. Every logical explanation my mind proposed was shot down by a cold, terrifying certainty. The voice had come from inside. I stood up so abruptly that my chair fell backward with a dull thud. I walked down the hallway, every muscle in my body tense. The living room was empty, bathed in the orange glow of a street lamp. There was no one there. I ran through the whole apartment, opening closets, looking under the bed. I was alone. With trembling hands, I picked up the phone and called her. She answered on the second ring, her voice sleepy and concerned. She was fine. She was at home, in her bed. I lied, said I had dialed by mistake. I hung up and slid to the floor, hugging my knees. It wasn't my imagination. It wasn't stress. Something was in my house, and it knew my mother's voice. The phenomenon became bolder, more intimate. It stopped using only the voices of others. It began to use mine. A week after the incident with my mother's voice, I was in the living room, watching a movie. I remembered a conversation I'd had with my sister on the phone a couple of days before, right on that same sofa. And as I remembered it, I heard an echo. Incredibly faint, almost imperceptible, I heard my own voice repeating one of the phrases from that conversation, the sound floating in the very spot where I had been sitting. The entity was replaying fragments of my past, turning my home into a sound archive of my own life. I realized that my silence, my solitude, was the perfect canvas for its macabre art. In an apartment full of people, of noise, of life, its whispers would have been lost. But in my world of calm, every impossible sound was a scream. The entity, which in my mind I began to call the orchestra, didn't need darkness to frighten. It only needed silence. I began to fight it with noise. I kept the television or radio on at all hours, even when I slept. I filled the house with a cacophony of sounds to drown out theirs. It worked, to a point. The echoes became harder to distinguish, lost in the background noise. But the feeling of being watched, or rather, of being listened to, did not disappear. And the orchestra was patient. It waited for its moments. The night of the blackout, it found its opportunity. A summer storm hit the city. A bolt of lightning struck nearby, and the power in my apartment went out, leaving me in an absolute darkness and silence, broken only by the sound of the rain. At first, nothing happened. I lit some candles, sat on the sofa, and waited for the power to return. And then, the concert began. It started with the cry of a baby, impossibly near. Then, the sound of an out-of-tune piano, right in the hallway. The orchestra began to rummage through my auditory memory, selecting its instruments with a precise cruelty. I heard the echo of my father's voice, not calling my name, but a single phrase from an old argument I thought I had forgotten. It resonated in the air, charged with the same anger as back then. I heard Leo's laughter from an afternoon a month ago, but now it sounded mocking, hollow. I even heard the ring of the hospital telephone, the call that had informed me of my grandmother's death years ago, a sound my brain had buried under layers of self-protection. It was a sound collage of my life, but only of its worst moments, a symphony of painful echoes that enveloped me. I was huddled on the sofa, hands over my ears, but it was useless. The sounds were inside my head. And then, in the midst of the cacophony, all the noises stopped at once. An unnatural, sudden silence filled the apartment. And from the darkness, right behind me, so close that I felt a vibration in the air next to my neck, I heard my own voice. It was not an echo of the past. It was a present, clear, articulated voice. And it whispered a sentence that froze my soul. It said, "Now I know what you sound like when you're afraid." Part 2. The whisper of my own voice, laden with a malice that didn't belong to me, was the final note that shattered my sanity. I lunged for the nearest light, the switch of the living room lamp, and flicked it with clumsy fingers. The bulb flickered and bathed the room in a sickly yellow light. It was empty. There was no one behind me. There was no one in the room. But the feeling of the air vibrating next to my neck, the echo of that whisper remained. From that night on, the nature of the haunting changed. The orchestra ceased to be a simple recorder of sounds and became a composer. It no longer limited itself to repeating the echoes of the building or my life. It began to mix them, to create new and horrible symphonies designed to attack me. It was no longer a passive haunting. It was an intelligent and deliberate assault. One night, As I was trying to sleep, I heard my mother's voice calling me just like before. But this time, her voice was layered over the sound of shattering glass. It repeated over and over. Her loving tone turned into a tortured plea by the sound of destruction. Another night, the orchestra took my own laughter, the echo of a happy conversation with Leo, and slowed it down. It stretched it out until my joy became a guttural, demonic growl that crept from the hallway. The game became crueler. The orchestra learned to use sounds to manipulate me. It would imitate the sound of the front door slowly opening, followed by stealthy footsteps in the entryway, forcing me to get up, armed with a fireplace poker, only to find the door locked and the house silent. It would reproduce the sharp, urgent beep of the smoke alarm, making me leap out of bed with my heart in my throat, only for the sound to cease the moment my feet hit the floor. My apartment, my sanctuary of silence, had become an auditory torture chamber. I was its only prisoner. Sleep became impossible. I spent my nights awake, sitting on the sofa, waiting for the orchestra's next movement, the next sonic attack. My work suffered to the point that I had to request a leave of absence. I couldn't concentrate. I couldn't transcribe the words of others when my own were being used against me. I knew I couldn't flee. The orchestra was tied to the building, to its echo-laden walls, and I had nowhere else to go. I was trapped. My only option was to understand it, to understand my tormentor. If I wanted to survive, I needed to know its history, its rules. With the energy of a desperate man, I began to research the history of the building. I spent my days in the municipal archive, a dusty, silent place that, ironically, became my only refuge. I rummaged through old blueprints, property deeds, construction records. The first searches were frustrating. I found records of a suicide in the building in the 1950s, but the story didn't fit the multiple musical nature of the sounds. I found plans showing the original apartment layouts were different, but they revealed nothing sinister. I spent endless hours in front of a microfilm machine, my eyes aching from the flickering light, reading local newspapers from over a century ago, looking for a tragedy, a crime, something that could explain a presence so anchored to sound. And I found it. Not in the property records, but in the society section of a yellowed newspaper from 1890. My building had not always been an apartment block. It had been built in the early 20th century on the foundations of another building, one that had been consumed by fire on a winter's night. The Grand Opera House. The night of the fire, an entire company, the full orchestra and several singers were in the pit, rehearsing for a new premiere. A faulty boiler exploded. The fire spread with terrifying speed. The exits were blocked. The article described in gruesome detail how the firefighters, unable to enter, could only listen to the screams and the desperate music coming from inside. A cacophony of terror and art, until the roof collapsed and all fell silent. 47 people died. Musicians, artists of sound. Everything clicked into place with a horrible clarity. I wasn't facing a ghost. I was facing an orchestra of them. A collective consciousness, fractured and maddened by more than a century of forced silence. They were not inherently evil, but they were desperate to do the only thing they knew how to do again: make music. And they had found in my silent life the perfect auditorium, and in the sounds of my existence, their new and macabre instruments. The fear they caused me, my terror, my anguish, that was their applause. They fed on the intensity of my reaction. That night I returned to my apartment with a new perspective. I was no longer the ignorant victim. I now knew my enemy. They were artists, and they wanted an audience. Their concert of terror was a desperate performance, a cry not to be forgotten. I decided I couldn't win by fighting with noise. Filling the house with music or television only gave them more material, more sounds to steal and distort. I couldn't win with silence either, because it was in the silence that their performance became clearer and more powerful. I had to change the rules of the game. If they wanted a performance, I would give them one, but it would be mine. My plan was simple and, probably, insane. I was going to give them what they so desperately craved, but on my own terms. I was going to conduct the orchestra. I spent the next day preparing the stage. I bought a single high-fidelity speaker and placed it in the exact center of my living room. I searched online until I found what I needed. A recording of the most controversial and conceptual piece of music ever written. A piece that redefined the very idea of music and silence. When night fell, I turned off all the lights. I unplugged the refrigerator, the computer, everything that could emit the slightest hum. I sat on the floor in front of the speaker, in the most absolute darkness and silence I could create. The orchestra began its usual concert of whispers and echoes testing the atmosphere. I waited until their presence was palpable, until the air was thick with their whispers. Then, I pressed play. No note, no sound came from the speaker. What began to play was John Cage's 433, a musical composition that consists solely of silence. The pianist sits, opens the score, and does not play a single key for the duration of the work. For 4 minutes and 33 seconds, I offered the orchestra no noise to compete with. I offered them a frame, a stage, an intentional, structured silence, presented as a work of art. I stopped being the terrified victim plugging his ears and became an attentive audience. I did not fight the sounds they created in that silence. I listened to them. At first they tried to frighten me. I heard the baby's cry, the sound of a window breaking, my mother's voice calling out with urgency. But I did not react. I just kept listening, motionless. When they got no fear from me, the orchestra changed its tactics. The sounds became more complex. The out-of-tune piano began to weave a melancholic melody, and the whisper of voices became a tragic chorus that accompanied it. They were composing. They were creating their own sad masterpiece on the stage of silence I had offered them. It was the longest performance of my life. The sounds swirled around me, no longer to attack me, but to express themselves. I was giving them what they wanted, an audience, but an audience that was no longer afraid, but understanding. When the 4 minutes and 33 seconds were over, the silence that followed was different. It was not an expectant, threatening silence. It was a quiet, almost sated silence. The performance was over. The applause had been my attention. The nights that followed were strange. I would sit in the darkness waiting. The terrifying bombardment of sounds did not return, but the silence wasn't complete. It was a tense, expectant silence. I wondered if it had been a truce, if they would return with more force. I spent several nights awake, listening, analyzing every creak. My peace didn't come, because although the war had ceased, I was still in the trench. Until one night, I heard it. It was incredibly faint, the melody of the out-of-tune piano, but this time it wasn't clumsy. It was soft, melancholic, almost a lullaby. It lasted for a minute and then faded. And in that moment, I knew it was over. It wasn't a trap. It was a thank you. The sounds didn't disappear completely, but they changed. They became fainter, more sporadic. The baby's cry was no longer a scream in the night, but a distant murmur. My mother's voice never called me again. The orchestra had not been destroyed, but it seemed to have found a kind of peace. Its desperate performance was over. I have learned to live with the echoes. Sometimes at night, I hear a fragment of a piano melody or the whisper of a distant conversation. They no longer scare me. They are just the ghosts of musicians who refused to be forgotten. I have become their only silent audience, and I have learned that terror, sometimes, is not born of malice, but of a deep and terrible loneliness, and that the best way to face a monster that only wants to be heard is not to scream louder than it, but to learn at last how to listen. The song was always the same, a melancholic piano melody that seemed to filter through the radio from a place far away. It always began on the same note, just as my headlights swept across the wooden sign marking kilometer 87. The road was a ribbon of dark, lonely asphalt flanked by the impenetrable blackness of a pine forest. A moonless night. The car smelled of old leather and the faint aroma of the coffee I'd had an hour ago. My hands gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles slightly white. I knew every curve, every crack in the asphalt. The dashboard clock read 11:43 p.m. The song on the radio reached its midpoint, a delicate pause between two piano phrases. And then, coming out of the next curve, they appeared. Two blinding lights coming straight for me in my own lane. A flash of panic, the screech of tires against asphalt, a scream I couldn't tell was mine or the other driver's. The world became an explosion of twisting metal and shattering glass. And then darkness. An absolute silence. The song was always the same, a melancholic piano melody. I shot up in my seat, my heart hammering in my throat. The same piano note. My headlights swept across the wooden sign for kilometer 87. I looked at the clock. 11:43. The car smelled of old leather and coffee. My hands were on the steering wheel. It had been a dream, an incredibly vivid nightmare, a hallucination brought on by the fatigue of a long journey. I let out a shaky breath, trying to calm myself. But the feeling of unreality was sticky, thick. The song on the radio, the same song, moved toward its midpoint. And coming out of the curve, they appeared again. The two lights, the flash, the screech, the impact, the darkness. The song was always the same. This time, the awakening was a scream, a real scream that filled the small cabin of the car. Kilometer 87, 11:43, the smell of leather and coffee. No, it wasn't possible. I looked at my hands. They were solid. I slammed my fist on the dashboard. The pain was sharp, real. This was not a dream. It was something else, something worse. The first time I tried to change it, I acted on pure instinct. The moment the first piano note sounded, I slammed on the brakes with all my might. The car skidded to a violent halt, tires screaming. I stayed there in the middle of the road, the engine idling, my heart racing, waiting. The song played on. It reached its midpoint. And just at the exit of the curve, the lights appeared. But this time, the other car, which seemed to materialize from nothing, didn't follow the road. It swerved sharply, as if magnetized, and crashed head-on into my stationary car. The impact, the darkness, the song was always the same. The next repetition, I decided to swerve. Instead of braking, I yanked the steering wheel violently to the right, trying to run off the road and into the forest. The car obeyed. It jumped the shoulder, the wheels sinking into the soft earth. I moved a few meters among the trees, and then, from between the darkness of the pines, the lights appeared, head on. Impossible. The impact, this time with the taste of resin and dirt. The darkness. I tried everything. I floored the accelerator, trying to get past the point of the accident before it happened. The crash simply occurred 50 meters further down the road. I drove in reverse. The other car appeared in front of me, as if I were moving forward. I turned off the lights, the engine, and sat in complete darkness. The other car's lights illuminated my interior for a second before the world shattered again. The accident was a fixed point in time. It was a wall. No matter what I did, no matter which direction I ran, I always ended up crashing into it. I don't know how many times I lived it. 100? 1,000? Time had lost its meaning, reduced to that single looping minute. The initial terror of the crash wore away, replaced by a gray, heavy despair. I stopped fighting. I became a passive passenger to my own damnation. The repetition became a form of madness, but also a form of useless omniscience. I learned every detail of my 60-second prison by heart. I knew that at second 17 a light brown moth would hit the upper right corner of the windshield. I knew that at second 32, the pianist in the song would play a slightly out-of-tune note, an almost imperceptible E-flat. I knew that at second 49 my headlights would illuminate a Y-shaped crack in the asphalt, inside of which lay exactly 7 loose pebbles. This absolute knowledge was my torture. Knowing every detail of my execution gave me no power to prevent it. I was the historian of my own demise, the expert on my own annihilation. I gave up. I stopped trying to escape and became an observer, a ghost haunting his own final moment of life, over and over. And it was then, when desperation gave way to observation, that I began to notice the inconsistencies. The car. It was my car, a dark blue sedan. But once, looking at the passenger seat, I saw a crimson silk scarf that I didn't recognize. I blinked, and the scarf was gone. Another time, the air filled for an instant with a sweet, floral perfume. The scent was so intense that for a second, I had a memory that wasn't mine. The image of buying a bouquet of freesias in a flower shop with a black and white tiled floor, in a city I'd never visited. The false memory vanished as quickly as it had arrived, leaving me dizzy and confused. And the scratch on the glove box. Sometimes it was there, sometimes not. My own hands. One day, as I looked at them on the steering wheel, they seemed strange, thinner. And for an instant, I saw the glint of pale nail polish on them. The vision lasted less than a blink. I looked again. They were my hands, masculine, unadorned. The panic returned, but in a different, more cerebral way. Was it my memory that was failing? Or was the loop itself flawed, like a video recording that deteriorates with each playback? I started using the rearview mirror, not to look at the empty road behind me, but to look at myself. My pale face, with the one-day-old stubble that always seemed to be there, stared back. But sometimes, in the instant, just as the other car's lights blinded me, the face I saw in the mirror was not mine. For a split second, it was the face of a woman, with long dark hair, her eyes wide with the same terror I felt. Who was she? Was she the other driver? Was I seeing her ghost? Or was I finally going insane? The idea that I was not alone in the loop, that there was another consciousness trapped with me, gave me a strange, twisted comfort, and a new mission. I stopped trying to survive. My goal now was to understand. In the following repetitions, I focused on the other car. It was a low red sports car, which always appeared at the curve at an impossible speed. I tried to see the driver, but it was always difficult. The glare of my own headlights reflecting off their windshield created a veil of light. Once, I decided to turn off my lights just before the curve. The world plunged into near total darkness. I waited. The red car's lights appeared, sweeping across the road. And for a second, they illuminated my own interior before I could react. And in the reflection of my own dark windshield, I saw my face. And beside me, in the passenger seat, I saw the ghostly figure of the dark-haired woman sitting watching me. The impact, the darkness. The song was always the same. My mind was in chaos. Was she in my car? Was I her ghost? Were we both dead? Or was she the one doing this to me? In the next loop, I made a decision. I would no longer look at my mirror, nor my hands, nor the passenger seat. I would look forward. I would ignore the song, kilometer 87, everything. I would only look at the curve, at the exact point where the red car appeared, and I would not take my eyes off the driver. I would use every millisecond of that encounter to see their face. The loop began. The piano melody, the wooden sign, my hands on the wheel. I held my breath. The song reached its midpoint, the curve, and the lights appeared. I didn't blink. I didn't swerve. I kept my gaze fixed on the red car's windshield, forcing my eyes to see past the glare. And I saw it. For a split second, before the world became a hell of metal and glass, I saw the face of the other driver with absolute clarity. It was my face. It was me, staring back at me with the same expression of absolute shock and terror. The impact, the darkness. The song was always the same, but now the piano solo had become a duet, and I no longer knew which of the two voices was mine. The reset of the loop was no longer a simple snap in time. It was the sound of an impossible question screaming in my mind. The same song, the same road, the same impending collision. But now, the threat wasn't just the approaching lights. It was the man behind those lights. A man who was me. My objective changed. It was no longer about avoiding the crash, an act that had proven useless. It was now about understanding the duality. If he was me, then who was I? And who was the ghostly woman whose face sometimes usurped mine in the mirror? Despair gave way to a feverish curiosity, the last defense of a cornered mind. I became a detective trapped at the scene of my own crime, a crime that repeated every 60 seconds. I began to catalog the anomalies, the intrusions of that other presence into what I thought was my reality. The crimson scarf, the floral perfume, the nail polish. They were clues. Fragments of another life, bleeding into mine. The car, my blue sedan, became my primary object of study. In one of the repetitions, instead of watching the road, I devoted myself to examining the interior with a desperate attention. In the glove box, I found the documentation. The car was in my name, yes. But the address, it wasn't mine. It belonged to a neighborhood in the city where I had never lived. Before I could process the information, the lights appeared, the impact, the darkness. The song was always the same. In the next loop, I knew what to look for. I opened the glove box again. The papers were there, the address. It was a piece of the puzzle. The car wasn't entirely mine, or I wasn't entirely me. The woman was the key. If her face appeared in my mirror and her things in my car, then perhaps this car, this loop, had more to do with her than with me. I decided to test a new theory. If I was in her reality, could she be in mine? I stopped looking at the road, ignoring the survival instinct that no longer made sense. I turned my full attention to the passenger seat, to the empty space where I had seen her in that reflection. I closed my eyes. I didn't try to wake up. I didn't try to change course. For the first time, I surrendered to the loop, but refused to participate in its visual drama. I focused on the feeling of her presence, on the memory of her perfume, on the echo of her terrified face. And the world broke. The sound of the piano song faded. The smell of leather and coffee disappeared. The feeling of the steering wheel under my hands dissolved. The darkness of the impact did not come. Instead, I was pulled through a tunnel of white light and silence. When the light dimmed, I was no longer in the car. I was standing in a room I did not recognize. It was white, sterile, and smelled of antiseptic. The only sound was the soft, rhythmic beeping of a machine. There was a bed, and in the bed, a woman lay motionless, her eyes closed, her face pale. It was her, the woman with the dark hair, the face in the mirror. She was connected to a labyrinth of tubes and wires that snaked their way to monitors displaying flickering green lines. I looked around, and I saw myself. My body, or a version of it, was translucent, ethereal, as if made of gray smoke. I was standing beside the bed, watching the woman. I cast no shadow. I could see the wall through my own hand. The truth hit me with the silent force of a supernova. The accident. I had not survived. I was dead. I was a ghost. And the loop, the endless minute on the road at kilometer 87, was not my prison. It was hers. The woman, the other driver, had survived, but her mind had been trapped by the trauma, reliving in a deep coma the last minute before the crash, over and over. I was not the protagonist of the story. I was a passenger, a residual echo, a fragment of my consciousness that had become snagged in her nightmare. The car wasn't mine, it was hers, and the inconsistencies were her personal details filtering into her memory. The reason the other driver had my face was because, for her, the man who hit her was just an anonymous figure, and my own ghostly consciousness had been projecting my image into that blank space. I remained there, in the hospital room, an invisible entity trapped in the antechamber of another person's mind. It was a strange, dual existence. I could see the real world, the nurses coming and going, their solid bodies passing through mine without feeling a thing. But at the same time, I could still feel the loop. I heard the piano melody as a constant echo in my head and felt the gravitational pull of the accident about to happen, again and again. I was a ghost with a foot in two worlds. I watched her visitors. I saw a man, probably her partner, who came every day. He would sit beside her, hold her hand, and speak to her in whispers, telling her about his day, reading her books. She couldn't hear him. She was too busy reliving our collision. I saw an older woman, her mother, who would weep silently in a corner of the room. I, the man who had caused all this pain, was there, invisible, forced to witness the consequences of my final act. From their fragmented conversations, I learned her name, Anna, and that on that night, she was driving home after visiting her sister. I felt a wave of compassion and guilt that surprised me. My own tragedy seemed small compared to her imprisonment and her family's pain. I was dead and free from suffering. She was alive and trapped in the hell of a single minute, and I was a part of her hell. My presence, the memory of my face in the other car, was one of the bars of her cell. In that moment, my purpose changed one last time. It was no longer about understanding or escaping. It was about freeing her. If my consciousness was trapped in hers, perhaps I could interact with it, not physically, but mentally. I closed my ghostly eyes and focused. I went back to the road, to the loop, but this time as a conscious observer from the outside. I could feel her panic, her repeated terror, the needle of her mind stuck in the same groove. I had to break the record. I couldn't stop the car. I couldn't change the road. But there was one element that was constant, that defined the loop as much as the accident itself. The song, the melancholic piano melody. It was the soundtrack to her trauma. If I could change the music, maybe I could change the memory. I rummaged through my own faded consciousness, which now felt like a damaged and fragmented archive. I searched for a sound that could counteract that sadness. My own memories were weak, echoes of echoes. I tried to remember a lullaby, but it was a formless murmur. I tried to remember a symphony, but found only broken fragments. I needed something strong, something with a life of its own. And then I found it. An almost intact memory. Not because of its importance, but because of its pure energy. A simple rock song from a summer in my youth, associated with a sunny afternoon and the feeling of absolute freedom. And with all the will I had left as an echo, I projected it. I tried to superimpose my sonic memory over hers. In the hospital room, I moved closer to the head of her bed. I leaned in, my ghostly face next to her ear, and sang my song into the silence of her mind. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, in the mental landscape we now shared, I heard the piano melody begin to falter. It stuttered, like a radio losing its signal. And then it was replaced by the sound of an electric guitar. My song. In the hospital bed, Anna stirred. A murmur escaped her lips. On the monitor, the green lines showing her brain activity changed their pattern, becoming more active, more complex. As her consciousness began to fight to awaken, to follow this new melody out of the loop, I felt my own ghostly form begin to weaken. The connection that bound me to her was breaking. By breaking her prison, I was destroying my own and myself with it. My form grew increasingly transparent. The hospital room faded. The last sensation I had was of my song playing loudly, a note of joy in the silence. And then, gratitude and peace. My final thought was not of terror. It was the strange understanding that sometimes an end is just the beginning of something else. I was a ghost trapped in a stranger's memory. But by helping her escape her hell, I found the way out of mine. I realized that my role in this story was never that of the driver, but of the passenger. And my true destiny was not to survive, but to help her return to life. And in that final act of empathy, I found a liberation deeper than any awakening. It wasn't a house that haunted me, it was the streets. I had always trusted open spaces, avenues that let you see the end, and vacant lots where nothing can hide. That's why the first time I noticed someone was coming up behind me, I told myself it was just my imagination and kept walking. It was almost 2 a.m. and I was heading home from my shift at the archive. The pavement was empty, the road too, and the wind pushed papers against the bars of a fenced-off lot. I quickened my pace out of habit. I wasn't wearing headphones. I like to hear the world I'm walking through. That's when the first warning came. A faint scrape of a sole against gravel, behind me, measured, as if someone were testing the ground before committing to a step. It wasn't an echo. An echo takes flight like a bird. This thing stuck to my shadow. I didn't look. I crossed the roundabout and, in the black glass of an empty storefront, I saw the hint of a body just inches from my back. It didn't have a face, it had a direction. I reached the night bus stop and stood under the streetlight. I waited. The light doesn't protect, it only exhibits. Nothing happened. The bus arrived, I got on, and I forgot about it until I got off 3 stops later. As I walked towards my building, the scraping returned, that sense of nothingness deciding to become a footstep. I opened and closed the front door quickly. I slept very little. The next day, on the platform for the number 3 line, I felt it again. The tunnel lights trembled as if they were breathing. A group of people waited for the train with the mechanical patience of routine. The sound came from my right and died just behind me. I turned just enough to look at the blank advertising panel, an opaque mirror. I saw it. Tall, leaning forward, a contour darker than the darkness, paused in the middle of a forward motion. A train car burst in and the reflection dissolved like smoke. From then on, I noticed them in places where sound stretches, footbridges, pedestrian tunnels, station corridors, the open grounds next to industrial parks. I started calling them the ones who walk behind. I didn't try to explain them. The days hold together better when you name the inexplicable without demanding an explanation. I learned to live with them, like a ringing in my ear, until I saw a hand. It was on the concrete footbridge that crosses the motorway on the way to the industrial park. It was hot, even at night. The railing burned to the touch. Halfway across the bridge, I felt a vibration that traveled up through my heels as if the structure itself had a pulse. The traffic flowed below with its unending roar. I felt a brief pinch on my shoulder blade, a tug on my shirt, and I turned. No one was there. But the fabric held the crease perfectly, as if a set of fingers had just gripped it. I looked at the ground. My shadow was not alone. Behind me, attached to my outline, was a shadow with no defined head, a body that was the idea of a body, with arms hanging at a strange height, too low, as if they dangled from a shoulder that wasn't its own. I crossed the rest of the bridge with my jaw clenched. When I got to the other side, I started running. I avoided that footbridge for a week and chose routes with people. Sometimes I walked along the coast. The sea, I thought, has its own laws, and anything that isn't the breeze will give itself away. I was wrong. One dawn, with the breakwater damp and the port breathing diesel, I stopped to look at the horizon. The city lights frayed along the pier, and then I saw them clearly for the first time, without the help of reflections. It wasn't one. There were several of them, in a line, like a procession without a saint, advancing behind me with the patience of those who are never late for anything. They walked where the paving stones end, and the rock begins, and their distance from me was constant. An invisible string pulled taut between their steps and mine. I walked faster. The string did not slacken. I felt that if I started running, they would run. I didn't. I moved away from the water, breathing through my nose, counting to 20. I didn't speak of them. Experience teaches you that certain confessions pin a stare to your forehead, and the gaze of others creates corridors in your mind. I kept silent and continued going down to the archive every night, as if the ordered boxes could contain the filth the city leaves outside, until the ones who walked behind began to cross paths with each other. I saw the first crossing at the long-distance bus station. There was a partial strike, benches filled with bodies sleeping in twisted positions, and a guard who walked with the air of someone who has already lost the battle. I was waiting for a night bus that was 2 hours late. I moved away towards the empty platforms to smoke. The ceiling camera oscillated with a tired motor. I saw them in the sheen of a powered-down bus, and I saw them with my own eyes. My followers, and others who were clearly not mine, parallel lines that crossed without touching, like currents in the same river. I understood that everyone drags their own along, and that sometimes the currents touch and move on. From that night on, I started noticing the details. Each one had a way of walking that seemed to be the result of an injury. A higher shoulder, a stiff hip, a knee that didn't fully bend. On the coast, one tilted its head towards the sea, like someone still listening to the last thing they ever heard. On the bridge, another seemed to have its arm in a sling. They weren't monsters from nowhere. They were the remnants of biographies. They traveled behind us like the delay of a blow, and they were malicious. Not for what they did, but for what they undid. The idea of being alone when you are alone. The greatest test came in the lobby of the university, where the white light exaggerates every speck of dirt. I went in to drop off some documents and left quickly. In the revolving door, the glass returned my body, broken into segments. In the second panel, at the height of my shoulder, I finally saw a face. Not the whole thing, just the mouth. It was twisted, as if just pried from a pavement. It had gravel stuck to the membrane, a thread of dried blood, and the teeth didn't quite close. I felt the absurd urge to clean its lips with a handkerchief I didn't have. I was frozen to the spot. The door pushed me and I almost fell. From then on, I started to smell them. At the exit of the metro, the air had a faint acidity, like metal rubbed with vinegar. In the stadium underpass, the dampness smelled of burnt hair. On the Industrial Park Bridge, at night, the wind carried a sweet perfume, as if someone had opened a box of old sweets to find only dust inside. The smell was more honest than the shape. The smell doesn't lie. It reveals what remains. The city, for me, became divided into zones of hard transit, with noise and bodies, and zones of soft transit, where sound bounces strangely, and you confuse your own heartbeat with boots on the ground. I noticed they preferred long lines, anything that imposes a rhythm and forbids a pause, shopping center corridors before opening, conveyor belts, the endless pavement that follows a canal, the fence of an airport with the runways beyond. I started to avoid them. But the city is made of lines. To avoid them is to stop living in it. One Sunday afternoon, I went with my sister to a picnic area by the reservoir. Families lined up folding tables. I thought that there, with the sun, voices, and cutlery, they couldn't reach me. I was wrong again. As we approached the shore, I felt a pull on my right heel. I looked at the water and saw a raft of floating weeds drifting backwards, as if someone were pushing it against the wind. The invisible string pulled taut again. I stepped back from the shore. My sister asked if I was okay. I said yes, that I'd slipped. She smiled, not believing me, and changed the subject. The first real contact came in a service tunnel behind the freight station. I'd been dodging them for days and exhaustion had made me clumsy. I went in to avoid a longer route. Halfway through, the light fixture failed and the gloom thickened. I heard my own breathing, and then another, right next to mine but offset by a beat. It wasn't an echo. An echo comes from ahead. This was born right where the shadow ends. A cold finger brushed my wrist, like someone feeling for a vein, and I snatched my hand back violently. The touch left a pale line on my skin. No mark, but the cold took hours to fade. That night, I dreamt of lines of people climbing a never-ending hill. When I woke up, I remembered a boy from the archive who had died on his bicycle. The back wheel was bent like a cymbal. His name came to me with the taste of iron. I whispered it twice, just to see. I felt a strange calm, as if someone had accepted an offering. I understood that they didn't want to be seen. They wanted to be remembered, not looked at but named. The following night, I went to the footbridge I had abandoned. I crossed slowly. When I felt the tug on my shirt, I stopped, looked at the asphalt, and said the boy's name out loud, and the name of a woman I had read about in a brief news report, run over on the bike path. The air paused. The pressure on the back of my neck eased a fraction. I crossed without any more tugs. I went home with the feeling of having discovered a key. It lasted less than a day. On the platform for the number 3 line, as night fell, the scraping returned. The ones who walked behind were not 2, nor 20. They were as numerous as the long lines in a city. There would not be voice enough to name them all. I thought about leaving. I fantasized about a desert, about roads that lead nowhere. But every fleeing path is just another line, and they follow the lines. I sank with that idea, and then another form of their malice appeared. They didn't just follow me, they got ahead of me. It was on the outskirts near the water treatment plant, where the trucks never stopped passing. I was walking, reviewing routes and names, when I saw about 30 meters ahead, a man standing still in the middle of the path, his back to me. His body was tilted, one ankle turned inwards, the posture of a badly healed fall. I took him for a worker. I got closer to ask him to move, and I caught the scent of damp, sweet metal. I wanted to say excuse me, but a name came out that was neither mine nor his. A name no one had ever told me, and yet, it tasted like a memory. The man began to move without turning, dragging a foot that didn't touch the ground. He wasn't coming to hurt me. He was coming to correct the order, to reclaim his place one step behind me. When he was right at the back of my neck, the August heat felt cold. I took a step back to look at him, and he mirrored the step, always behind, always half a second too late. I understood that I couldn't satisfy them one by one. No list would be enough. I decided to look for the place where the lines crossed, the exchange point I had seen at the bus station. There, I thought, there must be a rule. There, perhaps, it could be broken. I returned at night to the deserted station. I walked the platforms with my eyes on the ground. Nothing. Old oil, chewing gum, wet papers. I was about to give up when the blank schedule board flickered for an instant, as if catching a signal. On the glass, my silhouette appeared, and behind it, 5 more, all still, all lined up. I opened my mouth to say a name, and then, from the end of the empty platform, a voice that was not a voice said, "Come," and my shadows took a step towards me. They took a step towards me, and the echo of that movement filled the platform as if each shadow dragged the weight of decades with it. I couldn't back away. I stood frozen in front of the dead screen, watching my reflection multiply and split. They weren't mirages. They were there, tied to me by an invisible line I didn't understand. They moved forward again in unison, as if responding to the command of a single heart. I felt the urge to run, but I understood that the moment I turned my back, they would take my place, erasing me from my own existence. I opened my mouth to name the boy on the bike, the woman who was run over, anyone, but my throat closed with a knot of dust. No words came out, only a gasp that returned to me the echo of other gasps that were not my own. The silence of the station was broken by an electric crackle. The schedule screen flickered and displayed letters that formed no known language, just a sequence of symbols that vanished as soon as I tried to focus on them. The shadows behind me stopped, waiting. I understood that this was an appointment, a crossing point, and that if I remained trapped on the platform for one more second, I risked becoming one of them. I backed away slowly, without turning my head, until I reached the exit. When I passed through the deactivated turnstiles, the weight lifted, as if an invisible string had gone slack. Outside, I breathed violently, the dampness of the dawn feeling like a pardon. But it wasn't a pardon, it was a truce. From then on, I began to understand that the ones who walk behind don't seek specific places, but moments of transition. They exist in all the spaces where someone moves from one point to another, where there are trajectories instead of rest. They are parasites of footsteps, hunters of distance. I began to notice that when I stopped abruptly, they would disappear for a few seconds, as if the lack of forward motion disoriented them. But as soon as I started walking again, there they were, lined up behind me, recovering the exact rhythm of my movements. It was as if they could only exist in the space between one step and the next, in that interval where the will has not yet reached the body. I understood that I couldn't flee, because to flee is to walk. The only way to break them would be to stop forever, and I was not ready for that. For several nights I tried walking with others. I joined groups leaving bars, pretended to be on a call to merge with couples walking down avenues. I even accompanied strangers by feigning that I was lost. In those moments, the ones who walked behind would dilute, spread out among everyone. But as soon as I was alone, they would reform the line. I felt their steps on the back of my neck, their shadows gliding under the streetlights, their smells mixing with mine. They hated me in silence because I still had a name and a present, and at the same time, they depended on me to continue existing. I was the bearer of their line. One dawn, I dared to do something I had feared for weeks. I turned around. I did it abruptly, like ripping off a bandage. I was on the Industrial Park Bridge with the roar of trucks below. I spun and looked directly behind me. They were there, 5, 6, maybe more. Bodies without faces, but with visible wounds like fragments of severed lives. One limped with a leg twisted at an impossible angle. Another had a sunken shoulder, as if from a blow that had broken it forever. The woman tilted her head. A lock of hair stuck to her damp face. They weren't ethereal ghosts. They were the solid residue of interrupted biographies. They looked at me without eyes, but the intensity of that absence was unbearable. I didn't scream. What came out of my mouth was a name, the first one I remembered like a plea. They didn't retreat. They just stopped, waiting. Then, as if obeying some unknown rule, they all took a step at the same time. And I, as if pulled by a magnet, also took a step back, mimicking their gesture. I felt they were teaching me how to become one of them. From that night on, they began to appear in enclosed places where I had never felt them before. In the corridors of the archive, between the metal shelves, their shadows would glide behind me even when there were no windows or lights to cast them. Once, I left a box on a shelf, and when I turned around, I saw that another box, 2 meters away, had shifted on its own to the edge. I went over and touched it. It was warm, as if someone had been holding it just seconds before. Another night, while I was writing reports in the empty office, I felt the pressure of a hand on my shoulder, so real that I almost jumped out of my chair. No one was there, but on the computer screen, in the reflection on the black monitor, I clearly saw a dark contour behind me, as defined as my own. I closed my eyes and forced it away. I started avoiding the city at night, but they didn't let me. When the sun went down, even in broad daylight, I felt their presence in open places. In the abandoned football field, where the grass had devoured the stands, I saw them circling the track like impossibly slow runners who never reach the finish line. At the train station at noon, with people coming and going, I noticed them advancing along the empty tracks, always one step behind the noise. I understood that they no longer depended on darkness. They depended on me. My shadow was their door, and as long as I existed, they would have a place to walk. Then came the first sign of what was next. It wasn't a sound or a vision. It was a word. In the middle of the night, as I was trying to sleep, I heard my name in a low whisper, as if someone had spoken it right next to my ear. I opened my eyes and the room was empty. But when I turned towards the wall, I saw my shadow splitting in two. A dark, thin line that mimicked my every move with a slight delay. I got up, terrified. I turned on the light. The extra shadow disappeared. But from that night on, they never stopped calling my name. Sometimes I would hear it on the street, through the traffic, a murmur that cut through the noise. Other times I would hear it underground, in the echo of the metro. Always the same tone, neutral and serene, filled with an unbearable patience, as if they knew that sooner or later I would join them. The climax came in the open ground of the treatment plant, where the paths cross in endless lines. I knew that there I might find the final intersection, the point where all the lines meet. It was an open space of gravel and weeds, lit only by industrial floodlights that looked like sick suns. I walked towards the center, aware that every step I took brought dozens of others behind me. The ground vibrated as if trodden by invisible multitudes. I stopped. I closed my eyes, and, for the first time, I didn't feel them behind me, but all around me, surrounding me. When I opened them, I was in the center of a circle of shadows, all still, watching me without eyes, with postures that betrayed absurd deaths, falls, crashes, blows, drownings. I understood that the circle would not close until I took the last step inwards, until I agreed to walk with them. I don't know how long I stood there, minutes, hours perhaps. Time warped as if the open ground were a membrane separate from the city. I felt that every second I remained standing without surrendering was a victory that kept me human. But I also understood the truth I had been avoiding. The ones who walk behind never disappear. They only wait, and every person drags their own along. When we die, perhaps we become part of another line. Perhaps that is eternity, to walk behind someone forever without ever reaching them. I couldn't resist any longer. I closed my eyes and took a step forward. The circle opened with a murmur of wind, as if they had been waiting for that exact gesture. I felt their alignment adjust to mine, the invisible string pulling taut with an absolute calm, and I understood that there was no longer any separation. I too was walking behind. I don't know who. Perhaps you, who are now reading or hearing my story. Perhaps tomorrow you'll notice a faint scrape on the ground, an echo that isn't an echo, a shadow that doesn't correspond to your own. If it happens, do not stop. Keep walking, because we are always there, one step behind, in silence, waiting for your turn. The air in that city did not move. It was neither heavy nor light. It simply existed. It had the taste of ozone after a storm that never arrives, and the smell of wet stone under a sky that has never known rain. I was sitting on a wrought iron bench, identical to the one I had sat on the night before, and the night before that. Twilight was the only law. It was not the dusk that precedes the night, nor the dawn that announces the day. It was a permanent state, a gray, diffuse light that emanated from the cobblestones themselves and the facades of the buildings, bathing everything in a perpetual melancholy. I called its inhabitants the sleepers. They moved with an excruciating slowness, as if walking through the bottom of an ocean of thick air. Their faces were smooth, devoid of expression, their gazes lost on a point that only they seemed to know. They wore simple clothes in muted colors that blended with the city itself. Grays, ochres, faded blues. They never spoke. The only sound was the soft echo of their footsteps, a constant murmur that was the soundtrack of that place. Every time sleep defeated me in my world, in my bed in Madrid, I would awaken here. There was no transition, none of the familiar sensation of falling into a void. I would simply close my eyes in my bedroom and open them in the city of eternal twilight. The first few times were confusing, terrifying. I tried to scream, but my voice came out as a choked whisper. I tried to run, but my legs felt as heavy as lead. I tried to interact with the sleepers, grabbing a man by the arm, but my fingers passed through his sleeve as if it were smoke. They were intangible, and I to them was invisible. Over time, panic gave way to a strange routine. I accepted that these recurring nightmares were a toll I had to pay for rest. I stopped fighting. Upon waking here, I would simply walk, explore. The architecture was an impossible mix of styles and eras. A 1970s apartment building might share a wall with a Gothic cathedral, whose spires were lost in the still haze of the sky. The streets twisted at angles that defied geometry, and sometimes an alley would end abruptly in a brick wall that, upon turning back, was no longer there, revealing a square I could have sworn I hadn't seen before. Despite the surreal nature of the place, there was a terrifying consistency. Every night it was the same city. I could resume my exploration where I had left off the previous night. The scratch I had made on a wooden bench with a stone was still there a week later. That place, in its own strange way, was real. The true terror did not begin in the city, but when its echoes started to filter into my conscious life. The first time was on a Thursday morning. I was leaving my building's entrance when something on the ground caught my attention. It was a cobblestone, a single one, different from the rest of the pavement on the sidewalk. It had a darker color and a pattern of blackish-green moss that was painfully familiar to me. I crouched down, feeling a chill. It was identical to the cobblestones of the Street of Silent Echoes, a particularly gloomy alley in the oniric city that I myself had named. I chalked it up to coincidence, a suggestion from my exhausted mind. But the coincidences began to pile up. One afternoon, while waiting for the metro, I heard a low, deep hum, an almost imperceptible vibration. It was the same hum one could hear near the great clock tower with no hands that presided over the Dream City's central square. I looked around, but no one else seemed to notice. The sound faded as the train arrived, but the unease clung to my skin. I began to be afraid of sleeping. I tried to fight off slumber with liters of coffee, with caffeine pills, keeping the lights on and the music loud. I managed to stay awake for nearly 48 hours. My body protested, my mind was foggy, but fear was a more potent stimulant than any chemical. In the end, it was useless. My eyelids closed while I was reading on the sofa, and in the next instant, I was standing next to the same mossy cobblestone on the Street of Silent Echoes. The city was waiting for me, patient, unchanging. That night, for the first time, I felt that I wasn't dreaming of the city, but that the city, little by little, was dreaming of me. My life deteriorated. At work, my performance plummeted. I would stare at the computer screen, but my mind was miles away, wandering the gray streets, trying to find a way out, an explanation. My friends noticed the change in me. I was pale, hollow-eyed, irritable. "You look like you've seen a ghost," a colleague from the office told me, and I could only force a smile while feeling an icy chill. I hadn't seen a ghost. I had seen something much worse. A place that shouldn't exist and yet was more persistent than my own reality. I decided to change my tactics. If I couldn't escape, perhaps I could understand. I began to observe the sleepers more closely. They had always been part of the scenery to me, but what if they were the key? I focused on one of them, a woman in a long, ochre-colored coat who always walked the same route, from the Gothic cathedral to a small stone bridge that crossed a canal of black, stagnant water. Night after night, I followed her at a safe distance. Her walk was slow, methodical, her eyes fixed straight ahead. One night, as I watched her, she dropped something. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible gesture. A small, shiny object slipped from her hand and fell onto the cobblestones without a sound. I waited for her to move away and approached. On the ground was a key, a brass key of an old design. It was solid, real. I picked it up. It was cold and surprisingly heavy. Unlike the sleeper, the key was tangible. I put it in the pocket of my pajama trousers, and the next morning, when I woke up in my bed with my heart racing, the first thing I did was look for it. It wasn't there. I felt stupid. Of course it wasn't there. It was a dream. But the disappointment was so bitter it surprised me. That night in the city, I looked for the woman in the ochre coat again. I didn't find her on her usual route. I searched for what felt like hours, wandering through streets and squares, until I finally saw her. She wasn't walking. She was sitting on the steps of a large white marble building that looked like a museum or a library. She was not alone. Around her, other sleepers, dozens of them, were also sitting or standing, all looking in the same direction, towards the building's enormous closed doors. It was the first time I had seen them gathered in such a way, the first time their behavior had deviated from their meaningless loops. They seemed to be waiting for something. I approached cautiously, moving among the silent figures. The atmosphere here was different, charged with an almost electric expectation. It was then that I saw it. In the center of the grand staircase in front of the doors was an empty, dark stone pedestal. But as I looked at it, my perception shifted. I saw a flicker, a distortion in the air like the heat rising from tarmac in summer. The image solidified for an instant, and I could see what was on the pedestal. It was a statue, a sculpture of a man sitting on a bench, his head in his hands, in a pose of absolute despair. The figure was made of a gray, porous stone, covered in patches of blackish-green moss. The bench he sat on was wrought iron, identical to those throughout the city, and the man's face, sculpted with heartbreaking detail, was my own. The air escaped my lungs in a silent hiss. I backed away, tripping on a step, and fell to the ground. None of the sleepers flinched. They continued to stare straight ahead towards the doors as if the statue of my own despair were a completely normal sight. I got up, trembling, and looked at the pedestal again. It was empty once more. The image had vanished. But the memory of my own face, carved in stone and eroded by the time of that place, was seared into my mind. It wasn't a warning. It was a sentence. That city wasn't just filtering into my world. It was claiming me, preparing a permanent place for me, carving my own monument for when I finally became just another of its silent inhabitants. I realized that every night I spent there, I left a piece of myself in its streets, and I didn't know how much of me was left before I disappeared completely. I woke up screaming, a real audible scream that tore through the silence of my flat and left my throat raw. I sat up in bed, drenched in a cold sweat, the image of the statue seared onto the inside of my eyelids. The reality of my bedroom, the orange light of dawn filtering through the blinds, the familiar sounds of the city awakening, provided no comfort. It was all fragile, temporary. The true reality, the solid, enduring one, was that of the city of stone and twilight. Life became impossible. I stopped going to work, feigning a sudden illness. I couldn't face people, their trivial conversations, their lives anchored in a world that, for me, was coming apart. I spent my days in a state of fearful vigilance, jumping at any shadow, analyzing every sound. The hum of the clockless tower had become almost constant, a background noise that only I could hear, a vibration in my bones reminding me that the other city was always there, just on the other side of the veil of sleep, waiting. The streetlight across from my window flickered one night and went out. The next day, city workers replaced it. The new lamppost was different, made of black iron with a hexagonal shape and a spire-like finial that froze my blood. It was identical to those that illuminated the square where I had seen my statue. Every day, a new piece of the oniric puzzle clicked into place in my reality, overwriting the world I knew. The city wasn't filtering in, it was replacing, overwriting my existence with its own. Desperation drove me to seek answers in the only place I had left, the internet. I spent hours and hours typing feverish searches, recurring dreams of the same city, shared sleep paralysis, waking up in another world. The results were a jumble of New Age forums, scientific articles on sleep disorders, and amateur horror stories. Nothing fit. Nothing was as persistent, as tangible, as my experience. Just as I was about to give up, I found a post on an old-fashioned looking forum, a forgotten corner of the web dedicated to paranormal phenomena. The thread was titled, "The Terminus for Lost Dreams." An anonymous user, whose profile had been inactive for over 10 years, described a place with a precision that made me tremble. He spoke of the perpetual twilight, the silent inhabitants, the impossible architecture. He called the city the Sump, the place where the souls of those who get lost in their own dreams end up. The message was a mixture of resignation and warning. "You can't fight the Sump," the user wrote. "Trying to stay awake only speeds up the process. It feeds on your fear. The only defense isn't to build a wall, but to forge an anchor." The text didn't explain what the anchor was, and it ended with a chilling sentence. "She is calling for me. I think I'll have a new monument in the museum square tonight. It's been a good life." There were no more posts from him. To forge an anchor. The phrase resonated in my head. It wasn't a defense strategy, it was a survival tool. I understood that I had no other choice. That night, for the first time, I didn't fight sleep. I lay down in bed and surrendered to it with a new purpose. I was no longer a victim exploring his prison. I was a prisoner searching for the key to his cell. I closed my eyes and opened them on the steps of the great marble building. The sleepers were still there, their silent vigil unchanged. The pedestal was empty, but I knew my statue was there, a latent vibration. I had to understand what the anchor was, and the only place I could find an answer was in the very heart of my fear. I walked towards the pedestal. Each step was an immense effort. The air seemed to push back, the hum from the invisible tower intensifying into a painful pressure in my temples. I stopped in front of the dark stone and reached out a trembling hand towards the spot where I had seen the sculpture. When my fingers touched the seemingly empty air above the pedestal, a shock of pure cold shot up my arm. The statue flickered into existence before me, solid and terrifyingly real. My stone face stared back at me with eternal despair. Without thinking, I placed my hand on the stone forehead of my double. In that instant, knowledge flowed into me. Not in words, but in feelings, in images, in an absolute and devastating understanding. I saw the truth of the city. It was not built of stone, but of memories. Each cobblestone was a forgotten moment, each building an entire lifetime of experiences, unwillingly donated by its inhabitants. The sleepers were not trapped in a dream, they were the dream. Their minds, their souls were the bricks and mortar of that place. The city grew by consuming the realities of those who fell into it, and the monument was the final step. The moment a sleeper surrendered their last conscious memory, their identity, and became part of the landscape forever. And then I understood what the anchor was. The city fed on memory, but it could only consume that which was complex, narrative, the memories that form the story of a life. The anchor had to be something different, something simple, pure, and so fundamental that it could not be broken down, digested. It was not a memory of an event, but a primordial emotion, a feeling so deeply rooted in one's being that its existence did not depend on a story. I searched within myself, beyond the fear, beyond the despair. I rummaged through my life, not for the important moments. My first kiss, the day my father died, my graduation, for I knew the city would devour them like delicacies. I needed something more basic, and I found it. The memory not of a day, but of a sensation. I was 7 years old and sick with a very high fever. My mother sat on the edge of my bed and placed her hand on my forehead. I didn't remember her face exactly, nor what she said, but I remembered the feeling of her hand, the coolness of her skin against my burning skin. It was a feeling of absolute safety, of unconditional love, a feeling so pure and simple it had no narrative. It was an axiom of my existence. I clung to that sensation with all my might. I made it my only thought. The coolness of that hand on my childhood forehead. The city seemed to roar. The hum became a deafening crash. The statue in front of me began to crack, the gray stone crumbling like dry sand. For the first time, the sleepers turned. Dozens of empty faces turned towards me, and in their lifeless eyes I saw a glimpse of something, a mixture of surprise and longing. They were seeing me. I was no longer invisible. My anchor, my refusal to be consumed, had made me real in their world. The ground trembled beneath my feet. The twilight sky swirled like water down a drain. The marble building, the square, the sleepers, everything began to lose its solidity, to become translucent. And as the oniric world faded around me, I remained anchored to my one truth, a cool hand on a hot forehead. I woke up. But it wasn't like the other times. It wasn't a jolt, but a gentle arrival. I opened my eyes, and the air in my room felt clean, new. The morning sun streamed through the window, and for the first time in months it felt real. The hum was gone. The street light outside was back to normal. I got out of bed and walked to the window. The city, my Madrid, stretched out under the sun, vibrant and alive. I knew the other city was still there, lurking behind the veil of sleep. Every night I would have to find my anchor and hold on to it. Every night would be a battle. But now I had a weapon. I was no longer a victim. I was a survivor. And as I watched the morning bustle, a single clear thought formed in my mind. I was awake, but I would never be completely safe again. The eternal twilight would always be waiting for me on the other side of my eyelids. The world returned to me like a poorly tuned radio, a murmur of distant voices and a blurry light that hurt my eyes. The smell was the first thing I clearly identified, that antiseptic and strangely sweet scent of hospitals, a mixture of disinfectant and illness. I was in a room, lying in a bed with rough sheets. A dull, throbbing pain in my side reminded me of the reason, an emergency appendectomy. I felt weak, disconnected from my own body, floating in the haze of the anesthesia. The sounds from the hallway, the rolling of a cart, a muffled conversation reached my ears distorted, as if I were underwater. When my eyes finally managed to focus, I saw I was in a double room. My bed was against the wall. The other one by the window was impeccably made, its taut white sheets reflecting the gray afternoon light. It was empty. The first night was a blur of intermittent sleep and fleeting visits from a nurse who spoke to me in a soft, reassuring voice. It was on the second night that things started to go wrong. I woke up in the middle of the night. The only sound was the low hum of some machine in the hallway. And then I heard it. A throat clearing. A dry, brief, guttural sound that clearly came from the other half of the room. From the empty bed. I sat up a little, the pain in my side protesting. I looked toward the other bed. It was still empty, a pale silhouette in the dimness. I thought it must have been a noise from the hallway or perhaps a patient in the next room. Hospitals are noisy places. I tried to go back to sleep, but the strangeness of that sound so close kept me alert. The next morning, when a young, energetic nurse came to take my blood pressure, I asked her, "Is someone coming to occupy the other bed?" She looked at me with a professional but empty smile. "No, for now this bed is not assigned," she said. "So you have the room all to yourself. A luxury." Her cheerful tone did not reassure me. "It's just that last night I thought I heard someone," I insisted. "A cough, very close." She didn't lose her smile, but her eyes became a little firmer. "It's normal to be a bit disoriented after the operation," she said, as she jotted something down on her clipboard. "The medication can play tricks on you. Try to rest. It's the best thing you can do for your recovery." I didn't press the issue. What could I say? That I was sure the sound had come from an empty bed? She would think I was crazy. But the sounds continued, always at night, in the quietest hours. I would hear the rustle of sheets as if someone were turning over to find a more comfortable position. I would hear the light click of a plastic cup being placed on the nightstand next to the empty bed. They were subtle sounds, almost homely, but their impossible origin made them terrifying. My mind, clouded by painkillers, struggled to find logical explanations, but my instinct, my hearing, told me the truth. I was not alone in that room. The most disturbing sound appeared on the fourth night. A beeping woke me up. A rhythmic, slow and constant beep. The unmistakable sound of a heart monitor. But there was no monitor in my room. My operation had been simple. I didn't need such intensive monitoring. The sound was faint, almost an echo, but it was there, marking the slow pulse of a heart that didn't exist, of a patient I couldn't see. And it was coming, without a doubt, from the empty bed. That sound terrified me, in a way the cough or the rustling of sheets had not managed. Because it was a mechanical sound, proof of a presence that was not just ghostly, but medically alive in that bed. My hospital stay became torture. During the day, the room was a normal place, bathed in sunlight with doctors and nurses coming and going. But as soon as night fell and the lights in the hallway were dimmed, the atmosphere changed. The air became colder, heavier, and the concert of small noises would begin, with the constant accompaniment of the phantom heart monitor's beep. I started to fear the darkness, to fear closing my eyes. I spent my nights awake, watching the empty bed, memorizing every wrinkle in the sheet, every fold in the pillow, looking for any change, no matter how small. It was an exhausting and obsessive vigil. Every time a nurse came in, the sounds would cease completely, only to resume as soon as she left. I was sure that the presence, whatever it was aware of who it could manifest for. I began to notice things that went beyond sound. One night, as I was staring at the bed next to me, I saw the mattress dip slightly in the center as if a person of little weight had just sat on the edge. I held my breath, my eyes wide, hoping the light from the hallway would reveal a figure. But there was nothing, just the indentation in the mattress, which remained there for almost a minute before slowly disappearing, resuming its original shape. From then on, I began to feel the cold. Not the general cold of the room, but moving pockets of cold. Sometimes I would feel an icy draft pass by my bed, making the hair on my arm stand on end. The presence was no longer confined to its bed. It was starting to move around the room. I begged my doctor to discharge me. I told him I felt much better, that I preferred to recover at home. He looked at me with concern. "You're not ready to leave yet," he said. "You need a couple more days of observation. You are very nervous, and your lack of sleep is not helping your recovery." I tried to explain, to tell him about the noises, about the feeling of not being alone, about the indentation on the mattress. My voice sounded desperate, almost hysterical. "Doctor, I swear there is someone else in this room at night." He listened patiently, nodding, but his gaze was that of an adult listening to a child's story about a monster in the closet. He told me he was going to prescribe a mild sedative to help me sleep. He didn't understand that sleeping was the last thing I wanted to do in that place. That night I refused to take the pill. I hid it under my tongue and spit it out when the nurse left. I needed to be awake, alert. It was the worst night of all. Shortly after midnight, the beeping of the phantom heart monitor, which until now had been slow and regular, began to change. The rhythm accelerated, becoming erratic and anxious. Beep, 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 beep. It was the sound of a heart in distress, of a body that was failing. An alien panic took hold of me, a terrible empathy for the suffering of my invisible roommate. The beeps became increasingly frantic, and then, suddenly, they began to slow down, becoming spaced out and weak. Beep, beep, beep. I knew what was going to happen. It was the sound of impending death. Terrified, I fumbled for the nurse call button next to my bed and pressed it with all my strength. The red light came on above my door, an emergency signal in the darkness. As I waited, I heard a new sound coming from the empty bed. It was a rattle, a wet, guttural noise, the last breath from lungs filling with fluid, the sound of death. And then, the beeping of the monitor stopped, replaced by a continuous, long, high-pitched tone, the sound of a flat line. The silence that followed was heavy, dense, different from all previous silences. It was the silence of death. I stared at the empty bed, horrified, listening to that final tone that echoed in my ears. The presence, the phantom patient, had just died in front of me. And then, something happened that chilled my soul. The small red light of my call button, the one I had pressed, went out by itself. And a second later, in the silence that followed the high-pitched tone, I felt an icy cold on my right hand. Something, cold and thin fingers, had just grabbed my wrist with surprising strength. The cold from the fingers gripping my wrist was a grave cold, a total absence of heat that seemed to absorb that of my own skin. I screamed, or I think I did, but no sound came from my mouth. I was paralyzed by a pure terror that froze my blood and stopped my heart. I looked at my hand and saw nothing, but I felt the unmistakable pressure of 5 thin, bony fingers closed around me. The thing that had died in the bed next to me was now touching me. I closed my eyes, expecting the worst. A pain, a pull that would drag me out of the bed. But there was nothing, just the icy pressure. And then, I heard the sound of my room door opening. The light from the hallway flooded the room. At the threshold was the night nurse. The instant the light touched my bed, the pressure on my wrist vanished. The cold dissipated. I was alone again. The nurse ran over. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice full of genuine concern. "I saw your call light turn on and then off." I couldn't speak. I could only point to the empty bed, my hand trembling. "He died," I whispered. "He just died." The nurse sighed, a mixture of exhaustion and compassion. She took my pulse, which was galloping wildly. "It was a nightmare," she said softly. "The painkillers can sometimes cause very vivid dreams. There is no one in that bed. There has been no one here all week." She gave me a glass of water and stayed with me until my trembling subsided. I didn't try to convince her. I knew it was useless. To her, I was a confused patient. To me, I was the sole witness to a ghostly death. The nature of the haunting changed after that night. The phantom patient was gone. I no longer heard the cough, nor the rustling of sheets, nor the beeping of the heart monitor. The silence left behind was, if possible, even more terrifying. Because now I knew that the thing that remained was not a patient. It was a dead man. The presence became more direct, more personal. It was no longer confined to the other bed. Now it roamed the room freely. I felt its cold pass by me more often, sometimes while trying to eat. I would feel an icy breath on the back of my neck. One night, the book I was reading on my nightstand fell to the floor, as if an invisible hand had swept it away. Another morning, I woke up, and the curtain on the window by the empty bed, which was always open, was drawn halfway, blocking the sunlight. I began to hear whispers. They were faint, like the rustling of dry leaves, and I couldn't make out the words. But the tone was unmistakable. It was a tone of pleading, of a desperate need. The presence didn't seem to be malevolent, but terribly sad and lonely. It was trapped in this room, in the place of its death, and now that I had been a witness, it seemed to have clung to me as its only connection to the world of the living. I was being tormented by the loneliest ghost in the world. My physical recovery was progressing, but my mental state was deteriorating rapidly. I hardly slept. I spent the night sitting up, watching the shadows, listening to the whispers. I knew that in a couple of days I would be discharged, and the idea of leaving this place should have filled me with joy. Instead, it filled me with a strange sense of guilt. What would happen to him if I left? Would he stay here, alone, replaying his death night after night for the next occupant of my bed? One night, the night nurse, the same one who had come in when the ghost grabbed my hand, sat for a moment on the edge of my bed during her rounds. She saw my face, the expression of exhaustion and fear. I guess she felt sorry for me. "Still not sleeping well, are you?" she asked in a low voice. I nodded. There was a long silence. "Listen," she said finally, her voice barely a whisper. "I've been working this shift for 20 years. I've seen many things in this hospital, things that have no explanation. In that bed over there," and she pointed to the empty bed, "a man died a few months ago. His name was Julian. He was very lonely. He had no one, no family, no friends who came to visit. He never talked about his past, just stared out the window. He was scared, and he spent the entire night pressing the call button for any little thing, sometimes just because a magazine had fallen on the floor, just so one of us would come and sit with him for a minute, so he wouldn't be alone." The nurse looked at the empty bed with infinite sadness. "He died one night, right after pressing the button. We think he was trying to call for help. By the time we arrived, he was already gone. He died alone." Her words confirmed everything. The call button that went off by itself. The cold. The grip on my wrist. They were not acts of aggression. They were a desperate attempt at communication, the echo of a man whose greatest agony was not his illness, but his loneliness. The ghost didn't want to scare me. It just wanted company. That night was my last night in the hospital. The next morning, I would be discharged. I knew I had a choice. I could spend the night cowering, counting the hours until I could flee. Or I could do what the nurses, with all their work, had not been able to do for him. I could offer him company. I decided to stay awake. I sat up in bed, looking towards the empty bed. I waited. Around 2 a.m, I felt the cold in the room, a sign that I was no longer alone. And I heard the first sound, a faint throat clearing, the beginning of its ghostly routine. My heart began to pound, but it wasn't just from fear. This time there was something else. Instead of shrinking under the sheets, I took a deep breath and spoke into the air. My voice sounded strange, too loud in the silence. "I hear you," I said. "Good evening. I know you're there, Julian." There was an absolute silence. All the ghostly sounds stopped. The room fell into a total stillness. I thought that perhaps I had frightened it, or that I had been mistaken. But then I felt a draft of cold air right next to me, and I heard the rustle of the sheets on the empty bed. He had returned to his bed, and then, very faintly, I heard the slow, rhythmic beep of the phantom heart monitor. He was there, listening. I began to talk to him. I told him things about my life, about my job, about my family. I talked about the weather, about the book I was reading. I spoke of trivial, unimportant things, filling the silence of the room with the sound of my voice, a calm and unafraid voice. I got no answer, only the constant, slow beat of his invisible heart. But for the first time, the sound didn't seem frightening. It was the sound of him listening. I spent the whole night talking to him. I told him stories. I described the sunrise when the first rays of sun began to enter through the window. When the beeping of the monitor accelerated a little, I spoke to him more calmly, in a softer voice until the rhythm stabilized again. I didn't feel the death rattle. The high-pitched, continuous tone never sounded. Simply, as the daylight filled the room, the beeping became weaker and weaker, more spaced out, until it faded completely, like a song coming to an end. And with it, the cold in the room disappeared. The air became warm and neutral. The presence was gone. I have never returned to that hospital. Sometimes I wonder if anyone else has had an invisible roommate. I have learned that not all ghosts seek revenge or to frighten. Some are just echoes of loneliness, trapped in their final moment, repeating their last call in the hope that, this time, someone on the other side will answer. Sometimes the greatest terror is not the presence of the dead, but the fear of dying completely alone.